Hello, my name is Sister Sue Kidd, and I'm the chair of the board for the Canadian Catholic Campus Ministers Association. We're a national network professionally supporting campus ministers across our country. I'm also working full-time here at the University of Prince Edward Island, and we were awarded the privilege of hosting the CCCM annual conference this May. As part of our conference, the CCCM hosts a public lecture. It's an opportunity for us to reach out in the local church and to really help all of us build our relationships and a deeper understanding of our faith. The lecture is called the Sherlock Lecture, named after Bishop John Michael Sherlock, who was the 9th bishop in London, Ontario, and also served as the first Episcopal liaison for CCCM. CCM has enjoyed great relationships with the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops over the years, and this lecture, recognizing Bishop Sherlock, is an opportunity to acknowledge that and to celebrate that. This year's presenter is known to many of us, Austin Ivory. He is the biographer of Pope Francis. He's a journalist, a Vatican correspondent. He's an educator. When we began speaking about this lecture several months ago, Austin and we were wondering with the board a topic of the heart and mind of Pope Francis. What is it about Pilgrims of Hope? What is it about synodality? Dare I say, when we all woke up on Easter Monday to the news of the passing of Pope Francis, our grief struck to the core, but also left our board wondering, what would we ask of Austin? Austin, of course, rallied, being ever attentive to the workings that are going on in the Vatican, and Austin's suggestion for our topic for this video presentation, From Francis to Leo, reflections on the style of church in this change of era. Austin, welcome to Canadian Catholic Campus Ministry, and welcome virtually to Prince Edward Island.
Thank you so much, Sister Sue. It's really good to be with you and to address you at the Canadian Catholic Campus Ministry Conference in honor of Bishop Sherlock. And indeed, thank you for your patience with me these last turbulent few weeks. I was indeed in Rome for much of February, in fact, while Pope Francis was in hospital fighting for his life. And I flew back, of course, the day that he died, 21st of April, and then just returned to the UK for just after Leo's inauguration. So I was essentially out there for a month. And as indeed you just heard, I was commentating for the BBC as well as writing, being interviewed. It was a very, very intense and rich and moving and privileged time. A Paschal event, as Pope Leo, I thought, beautifully put it. But it was also, of course, very taxing and exhausting, and I need time to catch up with it all. All of which, of course, has meant that I can't be with you in person. So I hope one day that I can meet you all. It would have been fascinating to learn from you and about your vital work. I'm delighted that I'm giving this lecture in the wake of fellow synod delegates and experts. So Father Raymond Lafontaine, I believe, gave it last year. Sister Jill Golding, Linda Stout, all these people, of course, I know from the synod. So lovely to follow them. And great to know also that our shared sovereign is at the moment with you, affirming Canada as strong and free, just in case anybody south of the border should be listening. Speaking of Americans, I became convinced, in fact, a few days before the conclave, that the new Pope would be Robert Prevost, to the point, actually, that a friend of mine who likes to gamble, and he likes to place bets on world events, phoned me, I think it was 4 days before the conclave, and he said, "Who should I put my money on?" And I said, "Robert Prevost." And he said, "Who? He's not even on any of the lists." Anyway, he looked him up, phoned me back and said, "He's on at 50 to 1. He said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "I've got no time to explain, but yes." Anyway, he did very well out of it. He put £100 down and told me after the conclave and got £5,000 back. But I kept this prediction to myself, except once on air when I was doing an interview with CBS. And they began their interview with the question, "Do you think there are going to be any surprises?" And by this time, as I say, I was pretty convinced it would be Prevost. And I couldn't think of an answer that wasn't a lie. So I just blurted it out. I said, "Get ready for the first American Pope." and he virtually kind of fell off the terrace. So why was I so sure that it would be Prevost? I didn't know him, by the way. I have never met him to this day. I didn't know a lot about him, but I was hearing that the Latin Americans rated him very highly. And I was also hearing that those people who worked in Rome, when I asked after him, also respected him very much. And I knew he had grown close to Francis these last years. And not many people noticed this, but in February, about a week before Francis went into hospital, he elevated Prevost's rank within the College of Cardinals to Cardinal Bishop, which is a real honor. There are only about 5 or 6 Cardinal Bishops. The rest are Cardinal Priests or Cardinal Deacons. So it was, I thought, when I realized this, I thought, well, this is perhaps maybe Francis is telling us something here. So I looked into his background and I saw the extraordinary experience that he had had as prior general. And I was hearing from the cardinals that knowledge of the universal church was really, really important. And then to look at his career, the time he had spent in Peru, and then, of course, Francis appointing him Bishop of Chiclayo and then bringing him to Rome in April 2023, I suddenly thought this man really does bring together everything they're asking for or looking for. But above all, I think what convinced me was that here was somebody who, of course, American, yes, but really formed in the Latin American pastoral tradition. And I really thought, well, actually, this makes total sense because I've often been arguing these last years, really since my biography in 2014, that Francis has inaugurated a new era in the church. And that the source for this new era, this new vision, if you like, of how the church needs to relate to the world, essentially comes from Latin America. And that Latin America, if you like, was now the source of the universal church. So I began to become convinced. Now, as I'm telling you this, you may be thinking, well, this is a story of a conclave in which the cardinals come from across the world. They don't know each other very well. They draw up a profile of the Pope that the world needs and that the church needs. And they discover this quiet American, this Augustinian friar, and they kind of realize it's him. And they all gather around him. And there's a lot of truth to that because you cannot have a full ballot conclave without a consensus very quickly emerging around a candidate. This is essentially what happened in 2013. It's also really what happened in 2005. It's the pattern of modern conclaves. And the cardinals that I've spoken to and who have spoken about the conclave basically do paint that picture. But what they're not telling us directly is what we also know to be true, which is that there was a choice and there was a very clear alternative to Prevost in the first ballot. So the first ballot on the first evening, which in this case was Wednesday, the 8th of May, is when the cardinals discover who's in the room, where are the numbers in the room. And normally there are not more than 3 or 4 cardinals who have more than 15 or 20 ballots right at the beginning, they can count on. And really the whole action of the conclave happens around those 3 or 4 people. So what we know is that there was a clear front runner from the beginning, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Secretary of State. We also know that there was a lot of interest in another Peter Erdő, the Hungarian, a European conservative who got a bit of a name for himself in the 2015 family synod, resisting any kind of changes to the whole question of communion for the divorced and remarried. Now, we don't know how obviously the votes changed over those 4 ballots. I'm sure we will learn, we normally do. But you can assume that Parolin and Erdő were probably out there. Certainly Parolin would have been way ahead of the others initially. And then what would have happened is they didn't get beyond there and that Prevost, as it were, came from behind and gathered momentum. And this is normally what happens, is that the cardinals will see that momentum as a sign of the anointing of the Spirit. But my point is that even though Prevost gets elected fairly quickly, he ends up probably with just over 100 votes. There's still another 30 cardinals who would have voted for an alternative. And so there was a choice at the conclave. This is the point I want to make. But I don't think that that choice was well understood by the media narratives. And I think this is one of the reasons why Prevost wasn't predicted. So many interviews I did in the run up to the conclave, I was asked about the battle, so-called battle between liberals and conservatives. This is the frame, of course, of the film conclave. It's also our Western political frame. But I've been arguing that since 2013, since Francis's election, it's no longer the way really to understand the key divisions in the church. It no longer works, if you like, as a hermeneutic to understand the main dynamics at play in the church. That Francis has, in a sense, inaugurated a new era in which Catholicism is no longer fundamentally European with missions, or even fundamentally Western, but is a multipolar church. We saw this in the Synod, in which there are various centres of Catholicism, and in which the differences are really cultural more than anything else, and the way in which the church is understood, how the church relates to the world, and so on. So that the source of this, in a way, this new era, as I was saying earlier, was Latin America. And that Latin America is the source church for the universal church, not just demographically, that's where most Catholics now live, about 40% of the world's Catholics live there. But fundamentally, and I've been arguing this for many years, but because in 2007, in May, the bishops of Latin America gathered in a historic meeting in the shrine of Aparecida in Brazil. And that 2-week meeting followed a process over a number of years, which was a very synodal process. Latin America is the most synodal church in the world. And the fruit of that process was that 2-week meeting, which produced a document called simply the Aparecida document, whose main author was Cardinal Bergoglio, who becomes Pope Francis. And what the Aparecida document does is it grasps that we are now in what it calls a change of era. That this is post-Christendom not just in the sense that we no longer have a confessional state like in the Middle Ages, but post-Christendom in the sense that the church is no longer supported by law and culture, and that faith is no longer transmitted primarily through identity, through institutions, through family, and so on. That if you like, we're in a new apostolic age in which faith is transmitted more by contagion than by osmosis or by persuasion. By contagion, I mean that it spreads, as it were, from one person to another, through testimony, through personal experience. And fundamentally, there has to be an experience there of an encounter with the mercy of God in Jesus Christ, which then opens us to receiving or to learning then about the church and what it teaches. So what this implies, what Aparecida understood so well, and I've read the document many times, and I've read a lot that Cardinal Bergoglio was saying when he came back to Buenos Aires from Aparecida, when he was saying in his talks, you know, the world is going to be different. The church is changing. We can no longer rely on the ways we used to operate. To understand that the church has to change its way of being, its style. This is what I'm calling its style in the title, in order to evangelize this new era. Okay. So the leading light of Aparecida, as I was saying, was Cardinal Bergoglio. And after he's elected in 2013, as I recount in my books, he reformulates the Aparecida document as a universal papal teaching in Evangelii Gaudium. Now, Evangelii Gaudium doesn't contain a kind of diagnosis. It's not a sociological document of the change of era. What it does is provide a roadmap for the conversion of the church that will enable it to evangelize this new era. This is what they call in Latin America a missionary and pastoral conversion. So if I can summarize the Francis pontificate in a sentence, it is that he spent 12 years moving the church decisively in this new direction, showing the path, if you like, that the church needs to follow in order to evangelize this era. And in what he did himself, he performed that style, that way of being, in how he exercised the papacy, in what he said, what he did, the choices that he made. the trips that he made, and so on, but also the reforms that he carried out to enable or facilitate that conversion. And perhaps the most obvious one is the synodal conversion, the synod on synodality, but so many other ways in which he was essentially modeling and encouraging this new way of being that was humble, discerning, pastoral, ecological, synodal, fraternal, missionary. We can use various words, but we're talking about a shift here, and that shift would involve a disruption of the normal way of being. And Francis had a genius for disruption. He had a genius for interrupting, as it were, the normal way of things and showing a new way of being. And that disruptive style of his, of course, upset many, many people. But it also captivated the world, and that's why the last 12 years have been so extraordinary and so exciting. So this is the style of being church embodied by Francis, and I'll say more about it in the second half. I want to suggest that this was essentially the pressing issue in the conclave. Do we want to continue with this direction? And while it was clear that a portion of the College of Cardinals, and we're not talking about in any sense a majority, it's obviously a minority, but nonetheless quite a few of them, want to reverse this new direction. But the clear majority, the main body of the cardinals, wanted to continue and to deepen the course that Francis had set. And that is why we had essentially a Latin American as well as an American coming out on the balcony. I mean, Prevost is from the Americas in both senses, in all senses. And he very quickly makes clear in his address to the cardinals on the 10th of May, so that's the day after the conclave, after his election, I should say, he addresses the cardinals back in the Synod Hall, and he tells them that Francis had left a precious legacy that must now be built on. He talks about continuing on the journey that Francis had started. And so that they knew this wasn't just lip service, he spelled it out, that this meant renewing the path of the Second Vatican Council, which he said, and I quote, Francis masterfully and concretely set forth in Evangelii Gaudium. So he names the document, he names the roadmap, and he then highlights 6 what he calls fundamental points from Evangelii Gaudium, almost as the program of his pontificate. And I'm going to come back to those at the end. But let me just close this first part by just finishing the story of the conclave. So I think there were various reasons why, of course, people didn't guess the outcome or why it was difficult. He wasn't well known, the fact that he was an American, the assumption was an American couldn't be elected and so on. But I want to suggest that the main reason is that actually most of us, most journalists, most media, most commentators and so on, were trapped within this liberal conservative hermeneutic, which was really seeing everything as being a battle about doctrine. Whereas in reality, the cardinals, and I've confirmed this with them, were not sitting around discussing doctrine. Doctrines, the doctrinal questions in the church are largely settled. Of course, there are big differences over, culturally, particularly over how we view homosexuality or women, or, of course, there are big differences, but doctrinal questions are fundamentally settled. Rather, what was at issue at the conclave was the style of the church, how it relates to the world, and how, as it were, the church sees itself. And just to underline this point, Francis, as I was saying often when I first published the biography, Francis was not a liberal. He is not a liberal. He was as criticized as vehemently, by Western liberal feminists and indeed the German, synodal process, just as vehemently as he was criticized by American culture warriors and various kinds of conservatives. And Leo will be exactly the same. Leo is cut from precisely the same cloth. I was just listening to an interview earlier today, with somebody who knew Prevost well when he was Bishop of Chiclayo. And he immediately said, people are describing Leo as a progressive. He's not a progressive in any kind of liberal sense. He's a son of the church. He's loyal to the magisterium. What the church teaches, he believes. But he then goes on, this guy who's called Cesar Piscoya, then describes how Prevost takes over a diocese, Chiclayo, in 2014, that for decades had Spanish Opus Dei bishops, and described how he oversaw a pastoral plan essentially that would inculcate or introduce, Vatican II into the diocese. So a people have got ecclesiology, overcoming clericalism and sacramentalism, introducing lay formation, synodality from the beginning, diocesan pastoral assemblies, a very strong social dimension, attention to the signs of the times, a prophetic dimension, very, very engaged in not just in direct charity, but also formation in Catholic social teaching, heavily promoting the magisterium of Francis and so on. So do you see, it's really not, it's outside in many ways our categories. But of course, in reading that description of Bishop Prevost, I immediately recognized, I know the Latin American church very well, I immediately recognized virtually every Latin American pastor I know. Now, Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, age 91, at the funeral of Francis, described him as a pope among the people with an open heart towards everyone, who was attentive to the signs of the times and what the Holy Spirit was awakening in the church. Ray said that Francis showed us how to live as Christians in the change of era of which he spoke. He described how Francis was rich in human warmth. He was direct, he was immediate. He had a charism of welcome and listening that, quote, touched hearts and sought to awaken moral and spiritual sensibilities, unquote. Isn't that interesting? What Ray was stressing to the cardinals, sending a very clear message to the cardinals. He wasn't talking about what Francis believed, what he thought, what his theories were, but how he was, his style, his way of being, and saying to his brother cardinals, essentially, this is how you evangelize today. And those same characteristics were coming through in the communiques that we, the journalists, were receiving each day from the cardinals' discussions, in which they were speaking of the profile of the next pope, needing to be a shepherd close to the realities of people, one who embodies a Samaritan church close to the needs and the wounds of humanity, a spiritual guide offering mercy and hope, but also using very Francis language, one who would go beyond the confines of the church to promote dialogue, to lead a church that does not close in on itself, to use Francis's famous metaphor, but rather is able to go out from itself, salir de sí misma, to bring light to a world marked by despair. So I was reading these communiques and thinking, gosh, this really is a very, very strong desire for a pope who will continue in the way of Francis. And the other voices, there were other voices in the college that didn't make it into the communiques, but they were leaked out. We heard about individual cardinals complaining of the confusion that Francis had created, the need to restore order. One outburst from a cardinal called Beniamino Stella, that Francis had imposed his own ideas by opening positions of authority to the non-ordained. Shock, 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 horror, horror. The desire from a number of cardinals, Muller and so on, for restoring order, restoring control. These were the voices of those who had felt deeply displaced by the Francis era, by the change, the shift that I've been describing. And they yearned for a pope who could, in a sense, bring things back together, who could restore a certain kind of authority, resolving questions centrally by fiat, in essentially a clerical, hierarchical, Roman way. So my point is this: there was a choice at the conclave, but it wasn't a choice between doctrinal liberals and doctrinal conservatives. It was a choice between, to use Francis's metaphor, a church which is closed in on itself, self-referential, living for itself, and the church that comes out of itself, both literally in terms of missionary activity, but also existentially in terms of the way it understands itself. In other words, a church willing to transcend its existing institutional, psychological, cultural, and so on boundaries. Now, I realized that Prevost, I didn't know that Prevost would be elected, but I started to be pretty sure that he would be, because the cardinals whom Francis had created shared that diagnosis and that prescription, and they wanted to deepen and extend his reform. And in order to do this, they needed somebody who would take Francis's vision, but do things differently, build bridges with groups who felt alienated from Francis, but also have a more collegial governance. Francis was famously personalistic in the way he governed. I would argue it was necessary for the reform, but nonetheless, the cardinals, would say, well, he made decisions, very small, closed groups, and very much on his own. That actually what was needed now was a papacy that would institutionalize the Francis reform, embed it in the life and the mission of the church, one that would embed synodality and collegiality in the church, carry the curia with it. Francis so often worked outside the curia, and that Prevost was uniquely gifted and prepared to do this. So let me just go in a little bit more to understanding this change of era and this desire, conversely, to recover the old style. The breakthrough of Aparecida, and this is key, was not primarily intellectual. In other words, the gift of Aparecida was not its diagnosis of the change of era. Actually, that's quite well known and has been well studied. And in fact, what the Latin American bishops did was that they read very widely and they listened and they learnt to those studies. But the key move made by Aparecida, and it's really Bergoglio who makes it, was to understand that the church had a choice in how it could respond to this change of era, to what we call secularization. The diagnosis was that Christianity, fundamentally, that there was a loss of power and prestige, that Christianity was no longer supported by law and culture, that socially institutions, not just the church, no longer defined identity and belief and so on. And that there had been a rupture in the transmission of faith, no longer passed down through the milieu, as I was saying earlier, but in a very different way. So at Aparecida, the bishops observe this breakdown, they see this deeper shift, and they ask themselves, what does this mean? And how is the Holy Spirit asking us to change in order to evangelize this modern era? Now, I've looked at many documents across the world when I was doing my biography. I never found anything like Aparecida that had the courage to ask that question. In my second book called Wounded Shepherd, I described this as the option to discern and reform, rather than do what so many in the West were doing at the time, particularly in 2012 during the Synod on New Evangelization, which was lamenting and condemning. In other words, the response of the church to secularization was very often to lament what was happening and to blame the culture, or indeed, blame particular people within the church. The famous battle between liberals and conservatives was a kind of mutual blame game over the decline of the church. But what Francis does was what the Aparecida does was cut through all this. Now, Francis gave a great example of this. I don't know whether you remember in Quebec in 2022 when he visited Canada. He gave a great speech in which he talked about the negative view versus the discerning view of secularization. The negative view starts from a kind of a fear of the loss of power and influence, to which we respond aggressively or angrily, seeking to reconquer the space. So let's call that culture war Catholicism. And Francis brilliantly says, well, this is not Christian because it denies the incarnation. It causes us to flee from reality rather than making it incarnate in us. And he warns that if we do this, we close in on ourselves, we lament, we complain, we become gloomy, we become pessimistic, and none of this comes from God. So essentially, in Ignatian terms, he was saying the negative response to secularization produces a desolation in the church, which turns the church in on itself and makes the church incapable of evangelizing. And of course, what's going on there is that there's a clinging to what has been lost. But what is it that we're clinging to? We're clinging to power and social relevance, essentially. Well, what have they got to do with the gospel? So Francis contrasts this with what he calls the discerning view, which sees secularization not as the end of religion or even the decline of religion, but rather the transformation of religion. So that discernment distinguishes between what is essential to our proclamation and what is culturally contingent or accidental. And so much, of course, what we realize now that we took for granted in modernity, essentially the kind of clericalist model of church, is collapsing around us and giving rise to something new. And the question is whether we are willing to embrace that newness. So I essentially arguing that the key move in Aparecida was to understand that the Spirit is doing something important here. It's an opportunity for purification, for conversion, for a refocusing, if you like, on the essentials of the gospel. So Francis in Quebec, and he's citing Charles Taylor and Bernard Lonergan, he goes on to suggest three ways in which this might happen, in which we might welcome this. Well, the first is to return to the initial proclamation. This is a big, big theme of Aparecida. The initial proclamation is the proclamation of God's love for us, God's saving love. God has sacrificed himself for us, even onto the cross, in order to save us. God so loved the world that initial proclamation, to start always from there and to understand that experience, that understanding needs to be taken out to people rather than waiting for people to come to you. Secondly, by witnessing through the way we are, what one might call our habitus, how we are with each other, how we are with creation, how we are with God, indeed. Humble, meek, merciful, patient, hopeful. So to understand that in the apostolic age, we proclaim not firstly what we believe, but we proclaim by how we are as a result of what we believe. Yeah, this is what Thomas Halleck points out is fides qua rather than fides quae. That we might say that modernity has been very much, the church in modernity has been preoccupied with the content of its faith, what we believe. But we're called now in an apostolic age to witness primarily through how we are as a result of what we believe. Okay. So thirdly, by living fraternity, this is Francis's suggestion, but the way we witness in our own communities and the way we organize ourselves, we witness to God's own love, which of course has no borders. So Francis famously in Lisbon in August 2023, todos, 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 the church of everyone, everyone, everyone. Everyone is, because God's capacious love and mercy is so great, the church needs to also reflect that and embody that. So what Francis is understanding, what Aparecida is understanding so well, is the mistake that is often made by the church in the contemporary era, which is to sort of emphasize obedience to moral precepts in a culture where those moral precepts no longer make any sense because other paradigms are operative. Remember Evangelii Gaudium 39, unless we respond to the God of love in our lives, in the way we are, the edifice of the church's moral teaching risks becoming a house of cards. So people are convinced in this new apostolic age by a different way of being, which is fruit of an encounter with the love of mercy and God in Jesus Christ. And that experience of that mercy and that love changes the way we act, it changes the way we treat others, and it changes the way we treat creation and the world around us. And it is this, just as in the first apostolic age, the early church, this way of being stands in marked contrast to the values of the culture that surrounds us, which are marked, and we're now entering, in one might say, into another age of a certain kind of pagan brutalism, an age defined by or marked by an impatience, a violence, partly produced by technological power, the illusion of power, of the libido dominandi, the desire to dominate. That in this context, depersonalized, brutal, impatient, violence, the Christian way of being is compelling, it's captivating. It draws people in. There's a desire to know and to discover. So the shift that Aparecida understood has been, of course, accelerating since 2007 very dramatically. Here in England and Wales, we've lost a third of our congregations since 2020, since the pandemic. Most of them older people who had been going to church all their lives, and suddenly as a result of the pandemic, they're like, you know what? Why go back? And when asked why they no longer go to church, they say, we thought we wouldn't be missed. But at the same time, so we have the collapse of that cultural Catholicism. But at the same time, the cathedrals in our big cities are showing a really marked increase, something like 40% compared with 2018, 2019, according to recent studies, of people seeking to become Catholic at Easter, coming from no faith background. So people in their 30s, 40s, they might be younger, they might be older, but they're interestingly often in that age range, who are coming from a non-faith background. And these are the people that Thomas Halleck, the Czech priest, writer, in his great book, The Afternoon of Christianity, calls the seekers and the searchers. And Halleck's point is that in the new era, in the change of era, the church's capacity to walk with and accompany, as you do as campus ministers, to walk with and accompany the seekers and the searchers is, in a sense, is what will define the church of the future. Are we set up to do that? And this is, in a sense, what Evangelii Gaudium is asking us to do, to change the way we understand ourselves as church, to facilitate the encounter, to enable us to walk with the seekers and the searchers, and to enable their encounter with the mercy of God. I was actually amazed after 12 years of Francis, because I think the place which has least reacted in many ways to Francis has been Europe and the United States. But I was amazed to find after 12 years of Francis that a document that the Spanish bishops in the north of Spain produced just in Lent just now, which is a kind of a parasita for Europe. It's the first time I'd seen anything like this in Europe. It's called El Contraste Paciente, Repensando la Relación Iglesia-Mundo, patient contrast, rethinking the church-world relationship. And really what the bishops are doing there is they're saying everything I've just been saying about this change of era we're living in, and how the church now needs to rethink with creativity and fidelity our way of living and giving witness to Christ. And it draws on, it's a really fascinating little document, it draws on three main sources for this rethinking. The Word of God, Scripture, particularly Acts of the Apostles, the experience of the first Christians, and the magisterium of Francis, those three elements, which are in a sense can nourish this rethinking. And I was particularly struck by the example they took from the patristic or apostolic church, the first 2 centuries of the church, in which the church is growing very strongly, but of course at a time when it is completely not a prestigious institution. In fact, it's a persecuted institution. It doesn't have the support of law and culture. It doesn't have great institutions. But as all historians agree, it's spread very, very quickly, very, very strongly. And they refer to a book which I've read by Alan Kreider on the virtue of patience. So if you ask the early Christian apologists like Tertullian or Cyprian, what is it that sets the Christians apart? They would talk about paciencia, which is a bit different from what we mean by patience. Paciencia, a willingness to live and to suffer in confident expectation of God's action. So it's a mindset essentially marked by the Beatitudes, which Pope Francis, by the way, constantly referred to as the heart of the gospel. It means being humble, peaceful, non-violent, not vengeful, not anxious or controlling, forgiving, generous, calm in adversity. So it means turning the other cheek. It means going the extra mile for others in charity, loving those who persecute you. Cyprian writes, nothing else distinguishes the unjust from the just more than this, that in adversities the unjust man complains and blasphemes because of impatience, while the just man is proved by patience. In other words, the difference that our faith makes is that knowing how God has acted with us and to us, we can reflect that in the way, in our whole disposition, the whole way that we act and that we think and that our whole mindset, if you like. It's precisely this kind of strength and faith that astonished the Christian pagan future neighbors and created a new future. So Halleck would say that this mindset or habitus, this way of relating, tells us better what people believe than the cognitive expression of our faith. He talks about the faith of unbelievers as opposed to the lack of faith of believers. Both of them are possible. Yeah, that in, if you like, in the modernity, in the older era of Christendom, religion belief is a tool for affirming group identity and ideology, but it doesn't actually tell you very much about how that person is. But in our new era, intrinsic religiosity is what defines a Christian. And I was very struck, I think, when I was reading this, that thinking about what Trump is doing at the moment, what he's been doing since January, and independently of whatever his policies are trying to achieve, the way he goes about it, the brutality, the contempt, the violence of what he does and how he does it, the kind of pitilessness of it, it's so deeply anti-gospel. It's so profoundly against everything that the gospel teaches us. And yet, so many Catholics voted for him and continue to support him. And you begin to ask yourself, well, hang on, is there something very wrong here? You know, when people look at that and they say, well, hang on, do they not see a contradiction? So to be Christian now is more than assenting to doctrinal truths or moral precepts. It's a conversion in mind and heart to what Francis called God's style. That's the habitus. Close and concrete, tender and merciful, attentive and discerning. And authority exercised as service, not just vertically, and there's nothing in synodality which challenges the vertical authority of the church, but wants to supplement it with horizontality, with consultation, with discernment, with dialogue. And none of this, of course, involves a watering down in any way of the church's doctrines or beliefs. And it continues to fascinate me that critics of Francis accuse him of undermining or diluting Christian doctrine. It's just so obvious to me that he didn't do that. And yet the fact that they think he did is to me very significant. But what we're talking about here is how to embody how God is with us. As he puts it in Quebec, Francis, a witness abounding with gratuitous love, for that is God's way with us. So, my friends, let me just conclude in a much shorter final part. I want to go back to Pope Leo. And I mentioned at the beginning his address on May the 10th to the cardinals, which, by the way, was very striking because after addressing them, he asked them to take 5 minutes of silence and then to get into small groups and then to have a freewheeling discussion in which they help him to identify the priorities of the pontificate. So immediately you get this kind of collegial meeting. Synodal meeting, one might say, but collegial because it's the cardinals. And I think this marks the new way which we will see in Leo, this bringing collegiality and synodality into the heart of governance itself. But anyway, during that, and the cardinals were very struck by that, but during that speech, he talked about the 6 fundamental points from Evangelii Gaudium that essentially he was making clear would be the program of his pontificate. And I hope that having listened to me tonight and just thinking about the change of era and what Francis was trying to do, I wanted to leave it to the end to go back to this so that you can almost hear how he has grasped this in what he's saying. So the first thing he says, these are the 6 fundamental points from Evangelii Gaudium. The first was the primacy of Christ in proclamation, which we've been discussing. Yeah? In fact, I looked up and Prevost said back in 2023, this comes first, to communicate the beauty of the faith, the beauty and the joy of knowing Jesus. It means that we ourselves are living it and sharing this experience. So the primacy of Christ in proclamation. The second was the missionary conversion of the whole Christian community to enable others to encounter Christ in acts of mercy. So this is the whole missionary outlook of Evangelii Gaudium. We don't sit around waiting for people to come to us. We are now in a missionary context in which the church needs to go out, transcend its own boundaries, to offer that experience of the encounter with Christ. The third, growth in collegiality and synodality. And Prevost often spoke as Bishop of Chiclayo of co-responsibility. He would put a lot of emphasis on lay formation in the diocese, and he would talk about, we are all responsible for the life and the mission of the church in different ways. I'm your bishop, your pastoral workers, whatever, but we are all co-responsible for the life and mission of the church. So synodality as the key way of bringing about the awakening of all the faithful in the church to taking on that responsibility. The fourth was attention to the sensus fidei, meaning taking seriously the faith of the people as a discerning subject, where we actually recognize the protagonism of the faith of the people, that there's something going on there. There's a relationship with God. Francis was brilliant on this. The fifth, loving care for the least and the rejected, the option for the poor. The church must always be where the poor are. The church's attention must be. Ultimately, the Francis era was about the church being in the periphery, being where the poor are, just as Jesus was in Galilee rather than in Jerusalem. It's a place from which to view the world. The sixth and the final point was this, what he called courageous and trusting dialogue with the contemporary world. So a church that helps humanity to confront contemporary challenges rather than becoming a refuge from them. You know? So on this last topic, on that topic of courageous and trusting dialogue, we know from what Leo has already said that he will be concerned with the new things, the rerum novarum of our day, above all, artificial intelligence, the impact of technology on work, on labor, and so on. And I'm sure we're going to see him modeling an approach very much in an Augustinian way, you know, to all these technical advances, which is both a critique of progressivism or naive optimism, but also equally a critique of apocalyptic pessimism. So in other words, to live in the world, not try to run away from it, but in a discerning way, to understand that we always need to understand what God is asking us in this situation with these new technologies at our disposal, how we can use that technology to build people up, to build communities up, and how, of course, that's subverted or undermined by the libido dominandi, the lust for profit and power, which Augustine was so eloquent on in City of God. But here's where I want to conclude. I think beyond what he teaches in his documents, and I'm sure we're going to get terrific documents, I think that Leo will show forth the City of God in how he is, in how he acts. I think we've already seen people testify, those who know him, who've worked with him, the way he embodies in his way of being the gift of peace. So I think what we're seeing from Francis to Leo is a continuation of the basic new direction of the church. Thomas Halleck said to me once, he believed that John Paul II and Benedict brought to a close the church's long dialogue with modernity, some fundamentally European dialogue with modernity, and that Francis is the first pope of this new global era. And I think what happens with Leo's election is that we confirm that this is the direction of the church for the next generation. And that we've had in Francis this extraordinary evangelizing papacy that in everything he did and said performed God's mercy, performed God's love, awakened people to their dignity in the way that Jesus did, just in the way he acted and the way he was. And we now have a much quieter Pope who will perform God's peace, God's gift of peace, who in his very way of being with us shows us how we can build peace in a fractured and divided world. And I wonder whether, if you invite me back in future years to give a lecture, or I come to you in Prince Edward Island and we're sitting around talking, whether we'll find that writers like me or campus ministers like you will be basically organizing workshops, much less on what the church teaches, but rather to study and learn from this new, powerful, ancient way of being. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Austin, you didn't know this, but we spent the campus ministers in the room spent the morning looking at our own organization and story and as one moment in our conference. And as I was jotting notes, I was appreciating how the Spirit working in us and working in you is kind of helping us to maybe put words on change of era. Austin is available for some questions. Sonal has a microphone. She's offered to be skipping around our room, and Gerard is in front of me with an eye to our chat. I think there are some people online who might want to comment or to ask a question of our speaker this evening. Comments or questions? Please, Donald. I don't know. Does Austin see Donald? No. Okay, Donald is here.
Hi, I'm Donald McGilder, chaplain at St. Francis Xavier University. What are some of the ways in which this new vision of the church could get stalled?
Hmm. Wow.
Did you hear that question? Did you hear the question?
You're on mute.
You're muted, Austin. These are big. Austin. Oh, Gerard, did you mute him? Oh, wait a
Yeah,
minute.
thank you.
Okay.
Now I can. Yeah.
Okay.
So, was the question how it can be sold?
Yes.
Stalled.
Stalled. Stopped. Stalled.
Stalled. Okay, got it. Yeah, stalled. Yeah.
Hindered.
How it could be stalled? Well, I mean, there's always a reverse gear, you know, and at the conclave there was a reverse gear. I don't think it was ever likely to succeed because just the way, as I explained, the way the body of the cardinals wanted to move. But you know, whatever it is, the 20 or the 30 who are deeply discomforted by this, I mean, they want to take it back, and it wasn't just sort of a doctrinally conservative. I mean, Parolin, for example, I think represented a way of being, you know, church, which is not conservative doctrinally, but nonetheless Italian, curial, you know, institutional and so on, which I think would have felt like a reverse gear. You know, to be honest, I was thinking afterwards that there were some wonderful Europeans who were being talked about, you know, but nonetheless, I think if a European had come out on the balcony, I would have felt that was also a little bit of a reverse, you know, or an Italian. But no, I don't. I think it can be stalled, but I don't think it's going to be.
Hi, it's Michael Clay from Thomas More College in Saskatoon. And I was just wondering if you thought if there was any notion that the Cardinals would lean towards electing an American Pope as a reaction to what's happening currently in the United States.
Yeah, a lot of journalists asked this question, and the answer was that the American Cardinals gave was that the Cardinals didn't elect Prevost because he was an American, and I think that's right. I think they elected him for all the reasons that I said. I think the fact that he was an American wasn't an impediment. I mean, I think one of the things that certainly when I speak to the English speaking cardinals, they say is look, the fact that we have a native English speaker as a pope is an extraordinary gift because America needs to hear from the church at the moment. And the problem, you know, a lot of Americans would say that Francis didn't understand America, you know, I mean, I think Francis understood America all too well, but they had an excuse not to listen to him. Right? They can't dismiss Leo because he speaks with a Chicago accent, you know. So I think they saw that as a gift, but they didn't elect Prevost as a kind of riposte to Trump. I mean, remember the Cardinals kind of, you know, papacy's gone for a long time and there's only one election, you know, and I mean he's 69. He could well be with us for, well, certainly I would have thought 15 years, possibly 20. Trump in 4 years' time, who knows?
Thank you. There's another question from the room, and then we'll go to a few online questions. Doug first, please.
Yes, you mentioned missionary activity, evangelization after proclamation of the gospel. One of the things that I've noticed being a chaplain in a very multi-faith university is as a Catholic priest, there's this instant kind of barrier. And, you know, it may be for a variety of reasons in me, but it could also be internationally with regard to how priests are kind of viewed. And with the clergy sexual use scandals, there has been an undermining of the priesthood, period. And one of the criticisms of Francis, like many of his predecessors and others in authority in the church, is that they tend not to necessarily see the issue, and they, you know, they can in their own way cover things up as well. And so until we get beyond this issue, elephant in the room, it's hard to do the missionary proclamation of the gospel when people are no longer open to listen, even have the conversation, let alone synodal church.
Yeah. Well, first of all, on Francis's record, I won't because we don't have time. But I would say that Francis did far more than any pope has done to change the whole way in which we understand abuse and indeed deal with it. To understand that the origin of clerical sexual abuse is ultimately it's an abuse of power, first of all, rather than sexuality, and that it's rooted in clericalism. And it's not just true of the priesthood, it's true in the world, wherever sort of celebrities have a sense of entitlement, there's a kind of corruption there. And I think Francis's systematic confrontation of clericalism, I think was huge. But I can also talk about the laws he's introduced and so on. Now, it's true that that he constantly faced criticism for not dealing sufficiently, harshly with particular priests. I think he of course did an enormous amount. Just before he died, by the way, suppressed the Sodalicio in Peru, an abusive movement, first pope actually to close down a whole religious movement or order that had abuse at its heart. And Prevost was very, very involved in that. And I've written a piece for Commonweal in which I talked about Prevost's whole role in helping the victims of Sodalicio out in Peru. So I think you're going to get. I mean, I think you had in Francis, and you're going to continue to get in Leo, a very a vigorous response to clerical sex abuse, and I think above all attacking the culture at the root of it. Yeah. But ultimately, as Francis would always say, we can't overcome clericalism simply by changing the managers at the top, because in a way that perpetuates the problem. Synodality is the response to clericalism.
Okay. Austin, there are 3 questions in the chat. The first one is from one of our colleagues at l'Université de Laval in Quebec City. He says, "Merci beaucoup, very enlightening. How can the faith of non-believers be of help in discovering how the gospel is pertinent in these contemporary times?"
Yeah, it's a lovely question. Thank you. I mean, Thomas Halleck, who I think is very good on this, would say that the future of the church is in Galilee. Jesus says to the disciples, meet me in Galilee. So you come back to Galilee, the place, of course, of the of the Gentiles. And why is that? Why is the non-believer so important to this? Because the non-believer asks the questions, has the stirring in the heart. I mean, the restless heart, which Leo's already spoken of, that Augustine refers to. The restless heart is, of course, the search for God. And in learning how to walk with those who have a restless heart, we learn how to connect, with searchers, and how to connect the experience of the mercy of God with what they are looking for. And that's, in a sense, where all faith is born, is in that primary encounter. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Another question, you've already named him, from our friend Father Raymond Lafontaine. Hi, Ray. And Ray says, shortly before Francis's death, he signed off on a 3-year itinerary continuing the synodal journey and leading up to an ecclesial assembly in 2028. Do you think Pope Leo will continue along that path, or might he have a different way of approaching the synodal journey?
Yeah, the short answer is, Ray, I don't know. Obviously, I've spoken in Rome to the people involved in the synod who you know just as well as I do. And they're very, very confident that Leo will be a completely synodal pope. And we've already seen that in his record in Chiclayo, also in that very first address where he talks about a synodal church. Now, it is possible, in fact, I know that synodality came up quite a lot in the cardinals' meetings prior to the conclave. And I know that there is an awareness that in some ways synodality has moved fast ahead of where most of the church is. And I think there is a feeling among many of the cardinals that, as I was saying earlier about the Francis reform, needs to be rooted now much more in the life of the church. Synodality would be a good example. So it is possible that he will look at the 3-year reception announced earlier this year and actually say, well, maybe we need to do things differently. I don't know. But what I am sure about is that he will very much be behind the reception. And he was, of course, one of the synodal fathers who voted for that final document. And that document isn't Francis's document, it's the document of the church. It belongs to the church, not to any particular pope. And that he will see himself, I think, as obliged, as wanting to implement it. But whether he chooses exactly to do it the way it's been prescribed, let's see.
It's like, stay tuned.
Yeah.
We, just as an aside, we had Catherine Clifford speak to our national
Oh, yeah.
Catholic students in January, and she was one of the writers of that final document. So she
Well,
was putting herself forward as writing Episcopal literature, or she was part of the papal writing of the text. But
yeah.
we do have a third question in the chat. Are we good to go to the chat? Anybody in the room? You're okay? This is from Teresa Robinson, who is one of our colleagues at St. Joseph's College at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. And Teresa says, I'm living in rural Alberta, and in many ways, the church feels polarized into these liberal conservative tensions.
Mm.
And the violence of the messaging we see with Trump is reflected here, brackets, sadly. As a parent and an educator, my husband who is listening, and a campus minister, how do I spread the good news that Francis began and Leo is continuing of this new evangelization? How do I help shift the dialogue in ways you have highlighted tonight?
Yeah, thank you. Gosh, well, I mean, I would say begin, well, as Prevost did in Chiclayo, he organized lay formation programs, hundreds of people apparently. It's very impressive. And they studied the documents of the Magisterium of Francis, Evangelii Gaudium, Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti. I think that's a great place to start, is with those documents. If I can also humbly recommend, also I have a little book, a retreat book called First Belong to God, which is spiritual exercises with Pope Francis, where I'm imagining Pope Francis as the spiritual director, which is a kind of like a spiritual way in to the teachings of Francis, but can be used in groups. I think whatever you do, I think it's important to look at the synodal method, to look at particularly conversation in the spirit, because in my experience, spiritual conversation is the best school for conversion of attitudes and minds and hearts, because that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about a cultural conversion, that it's not just about what we believe, but how we are with each other. And we live in a culture which, as you've just been describing, is violent, is impatient, is domineering, wants to shut down conversation, where truth becomes an instrument of power and so on. So in that context, people are coming with that, and in a way they're yearning for the opposite, and I think this is where evangelization becomes a service, because you can actually say, we're going to do things differently. And if you can do things very differently, marked by that kind of prayerful, discerning, creating space for the other, allowing tensions and disagreements to become generative of new thinking rather than the cause of polarization. And people see that in action, they find it persuasive and they find it captivating and they want to be part of it. So I would say begin there, begin with the documents of Francis, and then perhaps study them together using the synodal method.
Thank you.
Father Raymond's just recommended my book, by the way.
Exactly. You two are friends. Ray does say, First Belong to God was a wonderful guide to my retreat last summer. Highly recommend. It'll be on our watch list.
Thanks, Ray.
There's a question in the back, please, Jason.
Thanks for your talk, your lecture. I'm wondering, you've spoken about Francis as a kind of disruptive pope, which is a common hermeneutic on Francis. I'm wondering if there might be ways in which he was also contiguous with previous popes, because I know from lessons sometimes they're a bit uneasy when they get the impression that the magisterium began in 2013
but in fact, magisterial teaching is before 2013. And sometimes it can feel like it's all wrong. And there's a bit of, sometimes students are pretty uneasy with that. I'm wondering if there's ways in which you see continuity
Yeah.
of Francis and how that might continue with Leo.
Yeah. No, I think there's tremendous continuity, particularly I think between Benedict and Francis. And Benedict himself would say that theologically he and Francis were absolutely, on the same page when it came to mercy. And of course, mercy was also John Paul II's great, great teaching as well. So there's a continuity definitely in all three of those papacies. I think that the way I would put it would be this, that the John Paul II and Benedict papacies were deeply concerned with clarifying the doctrines of the Second Vatican Council and providing, as it were, a hermeneutic to understand those doctrines and those teachings, to provide an authoritative interpretation, let me put it that way. And one might say that the long papacy of John Paul II, with Ratzinger by his side, and then Benedict, sort of having a dialogue with modernity, was what marked them. So, but I think what you get with Francis is the implementation of the council, of particularly the ecclesiology of the council, which to some extent has been postponed or put on ice by John Paul II and Benedict, precisely because of the divisions of the 1970s that arose over the council. So, I mean, I'm a great believer that each, as people say, the Holy Spirit gives us the Pope we need for the time, that each papacy builds on the previous. I think Francis couldn't have done what he did had the doctrinal questions not been settled to a large extent by John Paul and Benedict. And I think what Francis is able to do is then pick up where Paul VI had to leave off in the 1970s, particularly then you see with the synodality as an extension then of the Synod of Bishops. So that's how I see it. If you're asking me how they fit together, but I would say there's never, it's completely wrong ever to talk about a rupture between pontificates. Francis marks a new era because he comes from outside Europe, and because he sets out very deliberately to enable the church to hold together its multipolar cultural tensions in a fruitful way. I think before Francis, in a sense, Europe would be the place where those differences would be ultimately resolved in a kind of centralist way. That's where I see the big difference. And the fact that Francis understands this change of era in a way that Europe hasn't really come to terms with. So that's where I see the differences, and that's why I see that Francis really does open this new era. But I don't see it as in any way a rupture or discontinuous with what came before, but rather builds on it.
Thank you. Last call, either in our meeting space or online. May I just say, Austin, so the campus ministers in the room, we have 2 more days of reflecting and listening, conversations in the spirit. And we have, of course, a general members meeting, which is the highlight of our lives with financial records and elections and things like that. But I do believe that our organization is taking seriously invitations of Francis, and as Leo deepens that with us and for us. And so on behalf of the Canadian Catholic Campus Ministers and those friends joining us online, Austin, thank you very much. You've done us a great service this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sue. Thanks. Good to be with you all, and enjoy the rest of your time together.
Thank you very much. And we look forward to your visit to PEI for lobster and potatoes. Thank you.
Thank you.